Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's my great pleasure to host this creative thought forum event, which will feature a discussion with Theresa MacPhail, an anthropologist who is the author of a book called Allergic, Our Irritated Bodies in a Changing World. Before I introduce Theresa, let me mention our sponsors who make events like this possible. They include the Pellohemo Foundation, Adobo Catering, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, the Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, members of SAR's Founder Society, the Newman Zone Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, and Santa Fe Dining. These are all made possible through the generous support of organizations like the ones I've just mentioned, as well as our donors and members. If you'd like information on becoming an SAR member, please visit our website at sarsf.org or sarweb.org. It gets you to the same place either way. Let me mention another webinar, which will take place tomorrow on a very different topic. Christopher Nelson of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, will be giving a talk entitled Phantom Japan, Okamoto Taro's Art and the Ethnography of Okinawa. Information on that is available at sarsf.info/Japan. Again, enrollment is free, but you have to be registered to participate. That will be at 2:00 Mountain Time. One brief comment on format. I'll be talking for probably 45 minutes. We should have some time to take questions. And please use the Q&A panel on your Zoom screen to submit your questions. I will try and process them on the fly. We'll see how it goes. The idea would be to wind down the conversation by about the 1 hour mark, which is to say 3:00 Mountain Time. Theresa, sorry, please join me.
Hi, Michael.
Hi there. Theresa MacPhail, PhD, is a Berkeley trained medical anthropologist and associate professor of anthropology at the Stevens Institute of Technology. Aside from her published books, she has published articles in Newsweek, the LA Review of Books, Slate, and elsewhere. Our reviewer of this book for the Wall Street Journal described Allergic as, quote, an important and deeply researched book that memorably portrays the human face of disease. And he also notes that rates of hospital admission for asthma, nut allergies in children, and prescriptions for EpiPens have all tripled in recent decades, which is one of the reasons why this book is so important in bringing us up to date on the circumstances that are producing that remarkable increase in allergic disease and serious reactions. Theresa, let's just start by inviting you to tell the audience how you became interested in this topic, which, as you point out in the book, is somewhat outside the frame of conventional anthropological research.
Yeah, I mean, it starts really with my dad. So my father died of an allergic reaction to a bee sting when I was 24 back in 1996. But I was pretty young, and I used to think about, well, maybe I'm allergic to bees, and so I would be really nervous in the summer times around picnic tables and things like that. But I really started to think about it when I became an assistant professor about 9 or 10 years ago. And as most of you know, young people tend to get a lot of disease. They tend to get a lot of colds, and they bring them into the classroom. And so I was a young professor. I was teaching a lot of classes. They were new classes. I was stressed. I was tired, and I kept getting sick, which is kind of normal for a new professor, but I was getting sick a lot. So within the first year I taught, I got really bad chest infections about 5 different times. So I was on antibiotics 5 times. And finally, my doctor was like, something's wrong with the plumbing. And she sent me to an ears, nose, throat specialist who scoped me and said, you absolutely have irritation here. You have allergies. And this was kind of news to me because I never had symptoms to the extent that I thought I had a problem. And so I started getting really curious about this. Of course, eventually I trundled off to see an allergist, but I started talking about this with friends. And I was kind of surprised about how many people I was very close with that never talked to me about their allergies. So I would say, hey, this thing is going on with me. And then they'd say, oh, yeah, I have asthma. I've had it for years. Or, oh, I have actually, my kid has a food allergy. And these were co-workers, colleagues, friends. And I just started getting curious about like, how bad is this problem that everyone I'm talking to seems to have a story? And I went in search of easily accessible information about, how big is the problem? How long have we had the problem? Why? And I couldn't find really much that was written for a general audience. I found a lot of, research articles and historical, there are a couple of historians working on it, but nothing that really answered my questions. And I was complaining about this to a fellow anthropologist, and he said, hey, guess what? You know how to do this. And so he was like, why don't you write a book? And I thought, you're absolutely right. So that was really the impetus for me to just change tracks, because I had been researching viruses before that. And so I just threw all of that out and really started digging around and talking to researchers today, going back to the archives. So I did a lot of interdisciplinary work for this book. And then I just started talking to anyone that wanted to talk to me about their allergies, which turns out to be a lot of people.
That's clear from the book, I have to say. So for me, one of the memorable passages of your book is a statement that you quote by the research scientist Avery August, that our immune system is the curator of the human body. Can you tell us what that means?
I mean, it's really interesting. I think most of us grew up with the metaphor that our immune cells were police officers or army soldiers, or they were battling the things around us. And one of the best things I learned through researching the book is that's not really accurate. It's more accurate to say that they are deciding what can become a part of us. So if you think about food, you're ingesting things that aren't us. And yet our bodies, unless you have a food allergy, our bodies tolerate all of that material just fine, and in fact break it down, and it's allowed to become a part of us. And so the immune cells are really deciding that. What gets to be on us and in us, and what has to go. And so I really like this idea of them being a curator, or if you like, another way to think of it is they're a bouncer. They're standing at the entrance of a nightclub and they're deciding who gets to come in and who has to stay out. And they act accordingly.
A great deal of the first section of your book is about the definition of allergy, or rather profound disagreements among scientists and other people you interviewed about the differences between conventional allergies, such as hay fever, eczema, and forms of food intolerance, such as celiac disease. Are these completely different biological mechanisms that are covered by the same term?
Unfortunately, yeah. So, I mean, as anthropologists, I think one of the things we're trained to do that a lot of other disciplines aren't is think about historically the ways in which we've thought about things in the past kind of infect our thinking today. And so, like, how do those things mutate and transform into what we think about them today? And I think allergy has an unfortunate situation where it is, historically, it meant something very different. And so when we think about allergy today, it comes with that baggage. So it basically, the original term just meant a reaction. So it could have encompassed a positive reaction, like developing antibodies against the SARS virus, and having an anaphylactic event to eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Like, both things could have been classed as allergy because it just meant it was causing some different activity. And over time, that shifted to just be the negative activity. And it has to be the immune function. So intolerances aren't allergy because they don't involve the immune function. So a great example of this is a milk allergy versus a milk intolerance. If you have an intolerance, you just don't have the enzyme that helps you break down the protein, but your immune system never kicks in. If you have a milk allergy, your immune cells recognize that protein as a threat and then turn on your immune defense system, basically. And so that is the key thing. They all use the same mechanisms. But the way it was described to me, and a really helpful way of thinking about it, is every immune cell has choices they can make. say they have 4 or 5 options of things that they can do in response to something. But think of your PIN code on your phone. You have 4 digits that you have to enter out of a possibility of 10. But if you've lost your PIN code, you're going to be there a while if you're trying different combinations. That's literally thousands of different combinations. So an allergic reaction can be started in thousands of different ways. So it just has to involve the same mechanisms. So they all involve mast cells, histamine, and IgE antibody response. That last one's a little tricky because there are allergies. For instance, my dad's bee allergy, that's not driven by IgE antibody response. That's just your mast cells responding to a threat. So it's not a perfect definition, but we're stuck with this old term. So a lot of people are like, maybe we should just use something like atopy, which just means allergy, and just throw away allergy. But then what are we going to do? Like, it's such a ubiquitous term, like everyone uses it. So we're kind of stuck with it, if that makes sense.
So the one interesting thing, and you started getting into it in your last comment, was just how these cells, or whatever they are, they are cells, I guess, how they learn. That is, the first time they encounter something that they consider to be dangerous or inappropriate, something they don't want to curate in your body, they react one way, but then in the future they may react in different ways. So how does that process work? What's the mechanism for that?
I mean, there's two. The other thing about the immune system that's interesting that most of us don't know, and I didn't know at the start of this research project, is there's actually 2 systems online. One is much older. So one is called the innate immune system, and that is, evolutionarily speaking, like mast cells are maybe 500 million years old. We're not sure, but that's the guesstimate based on what we do know. And that system's online from birth, which is why it's called innate, and it responds generically the same way to everything. So it just turns on the immune mechanism. So killer T cells come and eat the thing, or macrophages come and absorb the thing that they found that they don't like. The adaptive immune system is much newer, evolutionarily speaking, and that's the driver of most of our problems when it comes to allergies. So those are the T cells. They're called memory T cells because they remember the things that they come in contact with. And the trouble is, so they'll be circulating throughout the neighborhoods of your body, and they'll come into contact with something. They'll take a snapshot of it, and then they'll take it to a B cell, which is responsible for producing your antibodies. And IgE is one of 5 different classes of antibodies, and it's the only one that we know that affects the allergic response. So your T cell will notice an oak pollen and grain and say, this isn't good, take a snapshot of it, show a B cell, and then B cells start pumping out IgE antibodies just for that oak pollen. And so then they're circulating just looking for that. And so that they have to make, the T cells are the interesting part of this, because they originally have to make a decision. So every time they come into contact with anything in our environment, they're making these decisions about, can you stay or do you have to go? And the really interesting part is we have no idea why they make the decisions they make. And in the same person, even if you're having an allergic response, some of your cells, your T cells, will have said, this is fine. It's just the majority of them have decided this isn't fine, which is why you've gone into the allergic reaction. And we really don't understand tolerance. That's what the researchers I talked to said over and over again, like, we've spent so much time trying to understand the allergic response, but we know almost nothing about tolerance.
So and let's see if I understand this correctly. Is there a difference, a radical difference between how these cells respond to pollen, which you just mentioned, as opposed to parasitic worm or snakebite venom, or does it work the same way?
Pretty much works the same way. It's a difference of degree. So and that's the really interesting thing about no 2 allergies are alike. So like, you could have a shellfish allergy and I could have a shellfish allergy, but yours might be super mild. Maybe you get a little hives and maybe I end up in the ER. And the reason is that we might be turning on, like, again, back to that PIN code, like our cells have been making different decisions, but the mechanisms they're turning on are the same. It's just a different order, or it's a different intensity. So my mast cells are going crazy, whereas yours maybe are tolerating things a little bit more. And that's really the mystery, is we really don't understand why in the world would people's allergies be so different from each other, and not just different from each other, but they change over time within the individual. So people can grow out of allergies. So you might have had an egg allergy as a kid, and then at 25, you're fine. And then more and more people today are developing what are called adult onset allergies. So people in their 40s, 50s, sometimes even 60s are developing allergies that they never had before. And we really just don't understand any of those mechanisms and why a cell would decide to make a different decision, even depending on sometimes the time of day. So allergies tend to be worse at night than they are in the morning. And, we think it might be hormones, but we're not 100% sure.
It seems like these days we want to reduce everything to genetics, and yet your book makes it clear that genetics is a factor, but not as determinative as one might presume. Is that correct?
Yeah, they've done twin studies, and, it's not predictive of an actual allergy. So you may have a predisposition. You might have inherited some gene segments that prone you to having this response, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll ever develop it. And in fact, like, this is one thing that I really want people to understand. When they skin test you, so when you go in for a skin patch test, all they're testing for is sensitivity. It doesn't actually tell you if you have an allergy. Like, an allergy is responding to the thing in real life, not like that's a very, they're artificially putting tiny bits of allergen underneath your skin. And that just signals whether or not you have a likelihood that you might either develop an allergy to that thing, or you are having a reaction to that, but not necessarily. Like, you could have a big welt on your arm as a reaction to grass, but then someone mows the lawn and you're fine. So it's really confusing to most people how this works and what the definitions are.
So, which raises the question of how accurate are those sensitivity tests, or how useful are the sensitivity tests?
They're useful in conjunction with family history and your own, noticing when you're having symptoms. So a good allergist will listen to a person's history, will kind of figure out, what's blooming when they'll help you keep track of your symptoms, and then they'll put everything together. But the skin tests are 50% false positive rate. That's quite high.
Yeah, I'll say.
Yeah, it's a coin flip, which is not a great situation. And they're terrible. I should say this. They're absolutely terrible for food allergy. The blood tests, so you can do a blood test that actually tests your antibodies. So they literally look to see if IgE is responding in your blood cells to a small amount of allergen that they add to your blood. That's much better for things like food allergy. The skin tests really don't tell you that much. So we're in a situation where people are relying on, like, most of us probably wouldn't know that necessarily. So you're looking at your arm and you're thinking, my God, I'm allergic to 30 things. Maybe not.
Well, and one of the curious things that you point out in the book that was news to me, and I presume many non-physicians, is that there isn't much uniformity in the samples they use for the skin testing. So why is it that they haven't achieved some kind of comparability?
I think this goes back to anthropology and culture, because I just think it hasn't been important enough to standardize. So it's really been left to the market. So, like a company who produces the allergens, they decide how they're doing that. So there's different methods that you can use to measure the amount of allergen in an extract, and they all decide. So if you get a sample, so if you take two different fish samples, say, one, it might have really different types of fish in that fish sample. So when you're testing for fish, you're maybe testing 2 or 3 different types of fish. And
Mhm.
depending on the company that you're buying that from, there could be a fish in one that's not in the other. And so and the amounts might be slightly different. And so it's really difficult to get information. Like if you're the poor epidemiologist, like if you want to study this and you're looking at things like test results, then you have to factor in that these aren't standardized, and then you don't know what to do with all that data because you don't know what samples people are using. It's kind of a mess, and I really wish that one of the easy fixes would just be to standardize them. But I don't know who's in charge of that, but
Yeah. And then there would have to be regional differences, right? In terms
yeah.
of the flora and fauna.
Yeah, if you're testing grass, like you guys are in New Mexico, it better have Bermuda grass in there.
Mhm.
But, for us in New England, maybe Bermuda grass isn't that important to have in the sample. So it really does depend on where you are. It was in some sense easier because allergists used to make their own allergen sets, in the early 1900s. And so they would just include things that were in their geographic region. But now people are, buying them from just a commercial factory somewhere. And so, yeah, it can depend what's in those samples. You really have to be careful about making any broad generalizations about what you're allergic to based on these tests.
Interesting. So one traditional approach to mitigating allergies is meticulous cleanliness, especially frequent showering to remove pollen and other irritants. Though ironically, as your book makes clear, there's now evidence that low-level exposure to irritants could actually have a beneficial effect. And
Right.
towards the end of the book, you say that you've decided to shower less, clean your sheets with less frequency, and so on. Can you explain the logic of that? And is it true that our houses are now too clean, too sterile, that we should be letting our kids play in the dirt?
Right. A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's originally it was called the hygiene hypothesis, and probably most people have heard of it. And what you've heard is exactly what you said. We're too clean. Kids should be allowed to eat a little dirt every now and then, lick a ball that's been rolling around in the dirt, and it's good for you. And the way they came up with this is there was a researcher in the 1970s who was looking at asthma rates and trying to figure out causation or look for patterns. And what he found was that in large families, so if you had 3 or more kids, the younger kids tended to be protected somehow, so they would have lower levels of allergic disease across the board. And his theory, he posited with the hygiene hypothesis that they weren't getting exposed to this, like the youngest ones were getting the benefit of the older ones coming home with germs. So, they would get a cold at school and then they would infect their younger sibling. And so you were getting all of these different bacteria, viruses, different things in the environment just brought into the home. And it looks like that's partially true. So now it's called the old friends hypothesis. So the argument is that 5,000 years ago, our environments were very different. And some of those bacteria and some of those viruses and some of those fungus are helpful, that they're friendly, that they're commensal, like they live happily in and on us, and that we need them in our environment to seed our microbiomes. The problem is we don't know which ones yet. So it is partially true, but we have no idea of knowing what ones we're missing. So the theory is that we're missing what we used to have around us, and because we're using all these antiseptics and harsh detergents and antibiotics, and we're being exposed to things we never would have in the past, like all the new man-made chemicals and some of the things that are coming into contact with our immune cells that they've never seen before. And so that's one of the theories for why we started to see a rise in allergies about 200 years ago.
Interesting. And so do you think, how do you balance the risk versus the benefit if you're a parent making those kind of decisions? It seems like a tricky, you don't know who to believe, which is another issue I
Right.
want back to.
Right. I think you err on the side of, for me, I started to think about my world a little differently. So I try to make decisions for the invisible things around me as much as the visible ones. So I don't buy anything with antibacterial anything. Like regular soap does a good enough job for most of us. So just thinking a little bit more about that, like, if you change your sheets less frequently, you're actually seeding bacteria both for your skin and for your nasal passages. So, but can you let it go a month? No, like, because then you've got dust mites, you've got other problems that in that space. So it's like trying to find this balance between letting some of that go and still not, of course, like none of us want cholera. Like there obviously are bad, bad bacteria. So we need to kind of be thinking about, we don't want to just kill everything though. Like antibiotics are a sledgehammer and they kill everything. And so we need to think about different tools and different ways of thinking about our relationship to the invisible world. And that's hard because for 100 years of germ theory, we've just been told that all germs are bad. And so most people would never think of a bacteria as being a friend, except that as we've found with, especially with the gut microbiome, they absolutely are. And so it just requires our culture to change to kind of allow things that we used to think of as just enemies to transition into a different category. And that's challenging.
Speaking of this small sized things, there was an interesting part of your book about nanoparticles in the air. And I'm thinking about that now because we've got, wildfires that are affecting our air, not so much in Santa Fe as in, say, Detroit right now, but we've had a history of that last summer. So how do those very, very small particles, which are not easy even to measure in the first place, how do they fit into the allergy equation?
So researchers in Cincinnati, so for those of you who don't know, Cincinnati is in a river valley, basically. And so at certain times of the year, the air kind of gets trapped depending on the weather patterns. And they also have 3 different major highways, interstate highways, threading through the city. So that's a lot of diesel exhaust just being flooded and sometimes getting trapped. And so researchers at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, they always suspected that there was a relationship between air pollution, particulate matter, and developing asthma and other respiratory allergy conditions. And so they, about 24 years ago, the kids are about 24 now, they enrolled a cohort of I think about 750 babies, and they mapped them in relationship to sources of especially diesel particulates. And I'll explain why that's important in just a second. And what they found was if a child lived next to a source of higher diesel particulates within the first 3 years, their rates of asthma went through the roof compared to the general population. And that effect lasted even if they moved to the countryside at age 7. So really in the early formative years, it was changing the immune system response. And what we suspect is that there's a relationship between things like particulate matter and pollen. And so it's like pollen can catch an Uber and be delivered deeper into the lungs if it attaches itself to these smaller particulates. And so they're kind of, and the same thing actually happened with COVID, interestingly enough. So COVID could attach itself to both pollen and particulate matter and stay in the air longer. So you can see differences in infection rate that track with things like air pollution and pollen rates. And these particles, so how small are we talking? We measure 2.5 microns and less. That's what we're talking. Some of these are 1 micron in diameter. And just so you guys have a sense of how small we're talking, a red blood cell is 5 microns. So I don't know about you guys, I can't see my red blood cells. Like I just see blood. It's so tiny. And we really only measure 2.5. There's no machines that measure 1. And unfortunately, the wildfire smoke is just replete with these very tiny particles, and they irritate your lungs. So they themselves can cause asthma just because they're irritating your lungs and driving an immune response. But then they can, if they coincide with high pollen levels. So right now in New York City, we're also having wildfires from Canada blow down, and there are high pollen rates. So my guess is we're going to see crazy asthma rates in a few years with all of these children getting that admixture of pollen plus particulate matter.
But do the particles evoke the same immune response because they're completely inert, right? As opposed to pollen,
right?
Body responds to them less decisively and just kind of lets them move in.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, at greater levels, you get more irritation, which is the same as pollen. I don't know if anyone who is listening right now has a pollen allergy that they've never had before, but pollen loads are increasing because of climate change. So plants like ragweed love increased CO2 levels. There's extra nitrogen in the soil because of air pollution. And so they're just proliferating and pumping a lot of pollen into the air. And if you have enough of that stuff, even without an allergy, you're going to get a response. So it can generate a response without an allergic reaction just because of the irritation of the mast cells in your nasal cavity and your lungs are going to emit histamine because they feel threatened. And so you're going to get like an asthmatic type reaction, which is why a lot of us we feel like we can't breathe in this air. It's because our lungs are really overloaded and are responding negatively. But what they found is that irritation then primes the lungs later. So then this poor kid is inundated with maple pollen grains and their lungs are already kind of fussy. And so they're learning to associate that irritation, not just with the particle, but with the pollen, if that makes sense.
And the body has only a limited ability to actually remove these particles.
Well, sadly, the particles, we can't remove them at all. So the more times, I hate to be a Debbie Downer about this, but they're too tiny and they sediment in our lungs. So you'll see like wildfire fighters, like they tend to have buildup in their lungs because of that. Like they don't go anywhere. So the more exposures you have, the more particulate matter you have, like it just stays with you.
And they actually get incorporated into tissues and at the cellular level?
They cause scarring. So scar tissue develops around them. So you'd be able to see it. Like, for instance, the 9/11 responders, you could see the scar tissue in their lungs from all the particulate matter that they inhaled.
Wow. So there was a really fascinating, it's kind of a footnote in the book, but your description of the alpha gal allergy, the so-called red meat allergy. Could you talk about that a little bit? That etiology was just so fascinating.
It is, right? And I think it's a great story about how climate change is accidentally doing things to us that we're not going to be able to predict. It's so unpredictable because what happened was, so about in the early 2000s, there was research on monoclonal antibodies, which we used in COVID. You've been hearing about them a lot. They're living biological cells that are used as treatments. They were doing some studies on cancer, using them as cancer treatments. And a few people were getting these treatments and having anaphylactic responses. And the interesting thing was, in order to have that level of a response to something, they had to have been sensitized to it. And so the question was, what's in this treatment that their bodies are recognizing, just some of them. And so an allergist was called in, a famous allergist, Thomas Platts Mills, and he was asked to figure this out. And so one of the first things he asked was like, give me plots of where these people live, like who's having these reactions. And what he found was it was exactly overlaid on top of the map for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And that's tick-borne. And so immediately he was like, get me everyone's blood. Because he was looking for, what he wanted to figure out is if you spend a lot of time outdoors. So he eventually found that the Lone Star tick, and as far as we know, it's just the Lone Star. And the Lone Star is interesting because when it injects, so all ticks inject something into you to make your blood keep flowing and to numb you, so you don't know they're making a meal of you. Right. And so when they did that, they're injecting a little bit of their last blood meal, which might have been a deer. So alpha-gal is a sugar found in all mammals, red meat. And so it's injecting a little bit of alpha-gal, but the saliva of a tick, the Lone Star tick, is itself irritating. So you will get itching from a Lone Star tick, and other ticks you don't get the itching. And so he surmised that something about the saliva plus the alpha-gal is letting the immune cells in your skin conflate the two. So it's being irritated by this tick saliva, and it's getting a little bit of alpha-gal. So it's thinking alpha-gal is the problem. So the next time you eat a hamburger, you throw up, you have violent diarrhea perhaps, and you're getting all over body hives. And it's because your immune system has decided that alpha-gal is actually bad because it was introduced in a way that your body isn't used to it. And it's such a fascinating story because why are Lone Star ticks in the regions that they are? So a lot of it is in Tennessee, Virginia. It's because they've been moving out of Texas because of climate change, because they are being attacked by fire ants who are moving north. So you've got this really weird story about random environmental changes intersecting with us and producing a brand new allergy. As far as we know, this did not exist prior to 2000.
And is there any treatment for it other than avoiding red meat?
That's it. Say goodbye to your barbecue.
So essentially the alpha-gal is just tagging along with the saliva, but that generates the immune response.
Right. Because your body doesn't really understand, it's not capable of understanding which part of that is causing the problem. So it's just going to respond to all parts, if that makes sense.
It's in your language, and we all do it. There's a kind of agency associated with these cells, but obviously there's a much more mechanical process. Is it just something that we don't understand at this point?
We have absolutely no idea. I mean, it is, I know I'm anthropomorphizing, but it's hard not to, because when researchers, they attach little immunofluorescent tags on these cells to watch what they do, and they do see them thinking. Like they pause and they really don't understand. Like there's no outward visualization of what's happening there. So they'll just then react but they have different ways they can react. And there's no understanding when they pause before they're acting. Well, what are they doing? Like, how is that working? And we really have no idea, and partially because we don't have the tech to understand that. Right. I mean, there's just, a lot of this depends on tech development, allowing us to see different things.
I mean, this would be at the molecular level or submolecular level.
Yeah, I was going to say it's almost getting into physics territory. Like you really need to be able to understand something intracellular mechanisms in a very detailed way, because they're responding to their environment, but they also are internally responding, and they're capable of getting signals from each other. So we really don't understand how the cell thinks about all of those things. And what other word, if I was going to use another word, I don't even know what it would be. Senses, I guess we could use senses, like how are they sensing that? But they do seem to have minds of their own. They do. I mean, it is very, because everything's the same. So you and I, all our cells have same genetics. We've had the same environmental exposures. And yet within us, the cells are making different decisions within us. So everything's the same, and yet they're capable of choosing differently.
But there must be some kind of crowdsourcing dimension to this too, right? They're responding to their fellow T cells, right. Whatever. So on the same line, I mean, I was struck towards the end of your book, and I hope I understood this correctly, that there's some evidence or there's some work going on to try and help cells or make cells forget their reactivity in certain ways. So how would that work? I mean, if somebody's trying to do it, they must have some ideas about the mechanism that allows the cells to remember this substance and somehow erase that memory. But what does that mean? I don't know.
So that's one of the thinking about like new directions for research. So we have been studying the reaction. So we know quite a bit about the allergic response itself.
Sure.
And so most of our drugs and treatments are built to interrupt that. But a true treatment for allergies would either retrain the immune system. So if you had an allergy, we could retrain it with something like immunotherapy, which is partially effective, but not great. Or we could prevent the problem in the first place by introducing these allergens into this body in a way that signals that they're friends. And so you could wipe the T cells' memory. So if you've already got a kid with peanut allergy, is there a way to get their T cells to forget that they don't like peanuts? And we don't know. So researchers are working on it right now via different mechanisms and testing out different things. And then there's some people thinking maybe we could use mRNA or nanoparticles to actually deliver. So what if the other way of thinking about it is, what if you could take a little tiny bit of that peanut protein and deliver it into your lymph nodes as acceptable? And so your antibodies would be trained on it and never recognize it as something bad ever again. So you'd prevent the problem from ever developing in the first place. And so they're using, of course, mouse models and in vitro, like cellular, seeing if this is actually a viable method. It sounds good. I hope it works. But of course, all the researchers, I said, we're decades out from any of this being reality, at least 2 or 3 decades.
You just started to talk a little bit about developments in immunotherapy. Have the new technologies produced the COVID-19 vaccines had an impact on allergy-related therapeutic investigations?
Not that I know of yet, again, but like that theory that we could use it. Like, so there's a lot of labs thinking, well, how can we use this for that? But part of the problem with the research side that I found is that immunology is really bifurcated into 3 types. So like if you're an immunologist, you're working on disease response. So you're working on things like vaccines or, how bodies respond to things like viruses. You're working on cancer. So you're working on like immunotherapies for cancer, or you're working on allergies. And historically speaking, the allergies arm has gotten the least funding. So just for a little fun fact for people, in the latest NIH budget, if you look, hay fever gets $6 million of research funds a year, and aging gets $6 billion. So, and it's not that we don't need to, I'm not suggesting we not study aging, don't get me wrong, but surely something that affects 30 to 40% of the population can get more than 6 million. So it's kind of been lagging behind until recently with the advent of more and more food allergies and more children ending up in the ER. It turns out we do care if our kids are dying. And so lots of money suddenly got put into allergy research in the 90s. So it's better than it's ever been, but it's still underfunded compared to the other arms of that. And they don't really talk to each other that well. And that's the other thing. So Cornell is actually building an immunology center that forces them all to talk. Because it's all the immune system. It's the same basic functions. And so is there a way that we can kind of get cross-pollination, pun intended, to advance the science just to understand the immune system itself, basic science, rather than all of this applied stuff we've been doing?
So apropos of that, is there any evidence that conventional vaccines, I mean, measles, mumps, chickenpox, and so on, have any effect at all on allergies? Unless, I guess some people are probably allergic to the vaccine, but absent that, I mean, does it affect our overall immune profile?
Well, people don't, so there's correlation, but not causation. So the allergy explosion in the US really starts in the 1950s and 60s with asthma and hay fever. And of course, that's also when you're starting to get more vaccinations, but you're also getting more antibiotics, and you're also changing your diet, and you're also getting more industrialization and more plastics. And you're also like, you're getting, and so, yes, I can tell you that if you mapped vaccination schedules on allergenic rise, you would see an overlap. But does that tell us anything? We don't know. I likely no, because we did have vaccines before that. So, we've had allergies started being a problem 200 years ago, and there were almost no vaccines 200 years ago. And so we can use that as kind of a way to say, probably not. When I ask researchers to really tell me, is there a smoking gun? All of them refused to answer and said, it's everything. It's all those things I just listed. We've changed so much about the way we live and our environment, and there's so much going on differently with our immune system that it's likely all of the above.
You talked about sounding like a Debbie Downer, and it seemed to me, I guess what I want to ask you, is there any good news that makes you optimistic about progress against allergies? I mean, it sounds like a way more complicated set of issues than most of us understand. So what is it, especially given climate change, declining air quality, longer growing seasons, and the ongoing exposure to new additives in our food, which you haven't really talked about, but would be a factor.
Absolutely.
So what is it, as an allergy sufferer yourself? What gives you hope, I guess?
I guess in the book, I say we have some hard choices to make as a society. Allergies is a great way of understanding that this is not an individual problem. For a century, we've made people's individual health problems their problem. You have a diabetes, you have to deal with it. And what did you do to cause your diabetes? And you need to get this under control. And allergies is really a great way of thinking about the situation we're in, because it is very much environmental. And, what's a pollen sufferer supposed to do? Avoid grass? That's not possible. So we have to think collectively about how we're living our lives. And we really have to get better about making decisions, not just for humans, but for microbes and for all the other things in our ecosystem. And I often say that I think people think climate change is going to cause biological problems in the future. So people are like, 50 years from now. No, it's right now. Any allergy sufferer can tell you it's happening right now. And so that gives me hope, because I feel like if people understand what we are doing to ourselves, so we're not just changing the external environment, we're changing our internal environment. And I think if people understand that, I think maybe we will start making those hard choices together. We will start living differently, is my hope. Because if we don't, then we're just going to get more and more irritated.
There seems to be a lot of irritation right now on a whole bunch of fronts. A couple more questions, then I'll turn. There are some questions that have come in, but I warned you I'd ask you this before we started. Is there one thing or two things that really surprised you in doing this research, considering all the people you spoke to and all the things you read? Was there anything that just completely took you by surprise?
I mean, one thing was just how people that suffer from allergies have internalized it to the point that they don't think it's a big deal. So they've just gotten the message that allergies don't matter. They're not heart disease. They're not cancer. And so I would ask to talk to people about their allergy. And I would often get people saying, why do you want to talk to me about this? This is not important. And I would have to kind of get them to agree to talk to me by convincing them, and indeed it is important. You don't feel well a lot of the time. And so that really was a wake-up call, not just hearing people's stories about how their quality of life is dramatically affected, but thinking about the ways in which society has really kind of failed them, because they've internalized this message that it's not important what they're going through. So they don't talk about it. They just deal with it. And that surprised me. And then relatedly, it surprised me. I went to talk to a psychologist here in New York at Mount Sinai who works with He works at the Food Allergy Research Center. So he works primarily with parents and children with severe food allergy. And he told me that based on his own research and surveys that parents of children with a severe food allergy have stress levels akin to someone who just had a major heart attack. And that really made me realize, like, people are out there coping with this the best they can, but it is really taking an emotional toll on people. And there's really, they have support networks that they've homegrown, but as a society, we're really not doing that great of a job of helping to support these parents who are dealing with more and more children who have severe asthma, severe food allergies. So we're kind of failing them. And that sits with me. Like, I think about that a lot.
So I'm looking at the questions right now, and there's actually kind of a dialogue going on between a couple of people in the audience. And it's interesting. So Dave comments on the language of agency, which we discussed earlier. And yet, Ava is saying, well, actually cells do make decisions in a brain type manner, but I guess it's fair to say we don't really understand how. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, like, how much agency does someone have over their own allergies? Zero. I mean, you're very much aware that, there's a limit to your conscious agency. And thinking about these cells and we didn't talk about the microbiome at all, but like, there's more and more evidence that our cells interact with all of these bacteria, viruses, and funguses all over our skin, in our respiratory tract, and in our gut. And they're living lives together, and they're kind of cooperating, and we have no idea what those relationships are like. And so I think it's fair to say that they have their own agency in a way, despite the fact that we are made up of them. We do not understand the way that they live their lives. Like, so the life of a cell within us, we don't really understand that much about it. And I think we're trying at this point. And I really think the microbiome research has driven a lot of that, because I don't know if many people know this, but if you do a genetic sampling of your gut microbiome, there are gene sequences we don't even recognize. They may as well be alien. We've never seen them. We don't know what they are. And so, yeah, it's fair to say that these things have agency that goes beyond our conscious agency that we don't really understand.
Audience member named Marina says, wonderful presentation. Thanks for the information so lucidly presented. I'm happy to second that emotion. I'd love to send you a copy of my essay, The Princess and the Pea, written in the late 1980s in an online form based on, I presume, her own experience. But she says the stress you talked about is very spot on. It's not trivial. In other words, it's an important fact of life for people suffering from allergies.
Yeah, it is. And I hope, one of the things I hope that this book does is allow people to feel seen and heard and reflected, and then feel like they can talk about it with people. Like, I hope this is a conversation starter, and that people feel justified in talking about this and with their friends and family more than they do. Because I do think we need to get better at recognizing those emotional factors in the stress factors. I mean, it causes a lot of stress. And so I would like to see us get better at acknowledging that, because I think even just acknowledging it goes a long way to helping people feel better.
So let me close by just asking you what your next project is. I'd love to know what the connection is between this and whatever it is you're working on now.
I'm going to do, so this really got me thinking about history and how we think about things, and how then that drives us in certain research paths. And so my next project is on aging. And so the working title is called Decrepitude, the History of Aging. And so I really am looking back to, when did aging become a scientific and a biomedical problem? Like, it used to just be part of a normal trajectory of life, and now it's considered, biomedical illness, for lack of a better word, a disease. And I want to trace, when did that happen? So I'm looking at like, when did the National Institute of Aging, which was the last institute created, that came online in the 60s and 70s. When did gerontology start up? And like, how does our thinking around aging really affect people's experiences of aging? So like, how do people experience aging? And then what messages are they getting from the biomedical community that's both affecting that and responding to their own needs? So it's basically going to be the same thing that I did for allergies, but with aging.
Well, you've got a big population to work with too. You won't have people finding informants. Theresa MacPhail, thank you so much. Congratulations on this terrific book. I can't recommend it strongly enough to our audience members. It's a complicated subject, and parts of the book are complex, but very clearly and systematically presented. So that's no small thing in our field. So thank you for doing that, and best of luck with your future research.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. It was a pleasure.
Okay. Take care.
You too.
So long, everyone.